This is the Mobile Philosopher Podcast. It's a lucky dip of strange distractions taken from the work of philosophers both living and dead. If you enjoy this, I hope you'll also enjoy the Mobile Philosopher books, of which there are 3, and they are available in all the usual places. You can find out more about them at themobilephilosopher.com. Today's episode, Weird Science. Maverick scientists have tried to show that telepathy is real. There have been lots of agreeably strange experiments over the years involving things like hypnosis and sleep and those playing cards you remember in Ghostbusters, putting people in lead boxes. Leningrad State University, for example, as it was known back then, had an institute for cerebral radio communication. You know, you put somebody in a lead box and then you see whether it's easier or harder to read their mind. It turns out that it's no easier. Wherever scientists go, philosophers follow, asking weird and awkward questions. So when the science is especially outlandish, the philosophy is irresistible. My favourite example comes from a lecture in 1935 by the philosopher Stephen Braude, in which Braude asks, imagine you had somebody with multiple personality disorder. Could 2 of their personalities communicate telepathically? Does that make any sense, he asks. So the philosophy of telepathy is bound to be full of weird and amusing questions. However, there's a chance that it also illustrates important insights into the mind. When they turn their attention to telepathy, the philosopher's basic question is whether it makes any sense. In principle, does it make any sense in principle for a telepath to come to know your thoughts directly without having to rely on any message sent to her ordinary senses? In 1978, Stephen Braude argued that telepathy, unfortunately, doesn't make any sense. Suppose you are thinking that it would be nice to eat a mandarin, and sitting in the other room, rubbing her temples, the telepath knows that you are having this thought. That would be an extraordinary achievement, because ordinarily we rely on sight and sound to learn what others are thinking. To know what's on your mind, I have to wait until you tell me, or write me a note, or look longingly at the mandarin. My access to your thoughts is mediated by your behaviour and the conventions governing the language we share. In contrast, the telepath has direct access to your mind. She doesn't have to watch you or hear you or decode any kind of message. Your thoughts simply arrive in her consciousness. To investigate whether this makes any sense, we should look in some more detail at your thought that it would be nice to eat a mandarin. What was it like for you to have that thought? Perhaps you formed an internal mental picture of the fruit. For me, the mandarin is on its own in a basket on a wooden table. Our imaginary telepath, reading your mind, would receive that same impression. Now, suppose instead I asked you to think of a small orange. I asked you to think of a mandarin, but suppose instead I said think of a small orange. What would that mental image be like? Perhaps you're more imaginative than me, or perhaps you just have a better understanding of fruit. But my mental image is the same in both cases. If you ask me to think of a mandarin, I form this mental image of a mandarin in a bowl on a table. But if you ask me to think of a small orange, I have the same mental image before my mind. Indeed, there are countless prompts that would produce in me that same image. The mental picture I would summon would be the same whether you asked me to think of a mandarin, or a satsuma, or a tangerine, or a sparse fruit bowl, or indeed ask me to imagine a wizard magically disguised as a mandarin. All of those prompts would make me form the exact same mental picture. So telepathic mind reading is therefore bound to fail. On receiving your mental image of a mandarin, the telepath won't know what fruit is being depicted, what fruit you're thinking of, or even whether you're thinking of a fruit at all. Perhaps you're thinking of a wizard disguised as a piece of fruit instead. Sometimes we seem to think in sentences rather than in images. If you think about a typical cinematic portrayal of telepathy, ordinarily the telepath receives your inner monologue. They hear your inner monologue. And of course, an inner monologue is not a stream of images, but instead a stream of sentences. However, here we have the same problem as before. To see this, imagine that you and I have just been involved in a food fight, and suppose you have the thought, the mandarin just flew past me. So reading your mind, the telepath receives this sentence into their consciousness, the mandarin just flew past me. Just like an image though, a sentence has multiple possible meanings. Here, the words mandarin and flew, for example, are both ambiguous. When you thought the sentence, the mandarin just flew past me, were you thinking about a small orange flying past your head, or were you thinking of a mandarin duck flying past your head, or perhaps a civil servant in a hurry? The telepath has no way of knowing what you meant by these words, so cannot read your mind by receiving this sentence. Maybe this seems like a technical snag, something that the telepath could overcome. But Braude argued that it wasn't. He argued that what these examples show is what they illustrate is an important philosophical truth, which is that representation always needs context. Suppose you experience an image of what looks like a mandarin. Well, is that an image of a mandarin, or is it an image of a small orange? As we've seen, there's nothing about the image on its own that settles this question, right? Because it could be that an image of a mandarin or an image of a small orange look exactly the same. So the question of whether an image is an image of a mandarin or an image of a small orange, that question has to be settled by a broader context. And this goes for mental images as much as it goes for paintings, for example. When the telepath receives a copy of your inner mental imagery, that doesn't settle the meaning of the imagery. A mental image only depicts a mandarin rather than, say, a small orange because of the broader circumstances. For example, my prompt, think of a mandarin. Right? Your mental image of a mandarin is a mental image of a mandarin rather than a small orange because you formed it in response to that prompt. In isolation, on its own, an image is not a picture of anything. The same goes for sentences. Any representation at all, be it an image, a word, or whatever, does not have its meaning by virtue of its inner nature. In part, its meaning must come from the context in which it's produced. When you and I communicate, there's a shared scene, noticed by the senses, which helps give our messages their meanings. It's because we're standing in the aftermath of a food fight that the word mandarin means a kind of orange and not a kind of duck or a kind of civil servant. So it follows that there cannot be a direct extrasensory reading of your thoughts. If someone wants to get a message from your mind, she must share your life in one of the ordinary ways. Rubbing her temples in the adjacent room will, unfortunately, achieve nothing. There are more of these, and you can find out more information at themobilephilosopher.com, where you can also find out about the Mobile Philosopher books. Thanks for listening.